Diversity is a noun. It means variety, a range of different things. Um, I really like this puzzle piece example or illustration, right? You have pieces of different shapes and sizes, different colors, different inputs, outputs. So diversity itself is just recognizing that these things are completely different. What diversity is not, you will hit the slide pretty please. It is not a code word for Black. So again, my background is in education, right? And we saw this diversity and inclusion push really come out of higher ed first. And it became like an umbrella category to put in a response to like the Black studies departments that started coming out in the 90s. So diversity is not a catchword for Black, right? If you need to address an issue that specifically affects Black people or Hispanic people, you have to say who you are trying to address. Otherwise, your well-meaning intentions could get lost. So one of my favorite examples is, again, in education. I'll use a lot of education examples. I'll try to use some sports and some other examples, but a lot of my work focuses on education. So again, in education, we don't necessarily know how to serve Black and Brown children because we lump them all as being low income children, right? So instead of saying that we have to address specifically your anti Black bias, we can lump it and say, we're going to have low income initiatives or we're going to have diversity initiatives, right? And we still haven't moved the needle in 60 years since Brown versus Board. Diversity is also not a catch all category for everyone who is not white, male, cis heterosexual Protestant, right? It is not just a bucket. I usually say we treat diversity like a ghettoization of work, right? So you put this stuff in this bucket, and then when we're not dealing with this bucket, then we play with the other toys. Diversity is not a thing that you put in a bucket over here to deal with when you're ready to deal with. It is a thing that has to be a top-down priority and ingrained in the entire culture of your organization. It's not a quota or target, right? So it's not like, oh, look, we've realized that our entire staff looks the same. So let's get one of this kind and one of this kind and one of this kind, and then we will have diversity. And it's not a department, office, or initiative in your organization. And I think that's really important. Again, back to this idea of putting things in buckets. Diversity is not one person's work. Diversity is the work of the entire organization or body. We'll advance pretty please. One more. There we go. So diversity is. I used to work for a company that every time I brought up a diversity conversation, they said, make the business case for me, right? Like dollars and cents, why should we care about this? So diversity is varied perspectives that are problem solving, which lead to increased productivity and profits. Simply put, you have a diverse customer base, service base, patient base, student base, right? And the better that you can serve everybody in that group, the better your bottom line will be, the better your data will be, which in some environments translates to your bottom line, right? If you are not including a bunch of perspectives at the table, then you have very one-sided problem solving, and that can affect your bottom line at the end. Diversity is a value system that implies respect and appreciation for, as well as acknowledgement of the differences between us. So it's not putting everybody in the room and saying, we're all the same, we experience things the same way because we are all here, right? I've kind of experienced that a little bit when talking to people in Pflugerville. The idea is that like lots of people want to live here, so it must be a nice place for people to live. We don't have to talk about individual populations sometimes because they decided to move here, which means that it's automatically a place that they want to be or a place that's welcoming. In practice, it moves from tolerance of differences to embracing them. So it's not me saying like, I love you even though you are different from me. It is, I love you because you are different from me. One of my son's favorite movies is Trolls, and by extension, Trolls World Tour. And we just watched Trolls World Tour on an airplane on our way home from DC a couple weeks ago. And I don't know, for those who haven't seen it, in Trolls World Tour, there's the pop trolls that were in the first Troll, realize that they're not the only trolls in the universe. And then they go off and they realize kind of their part in trying to force everybody to assimilate into a pop troll and how they didn't celebrate the differences of the others in the universe, right? Super cute. But but it is not, again, it is not, I'm trying to make you like me. It is not, I am tolerating you in spite of yourself. It is, I love you because you bring these different perspectives. That's pretty please. I'm gonna try to make up time a little bit. So we're gonna move into equity. Did anyone want me to stop, or does anyone have any thoughts on diversity? I wanna make sure we spend most of our time on inclusion. I also like very interactive panels. So if you have a thought or a question, I guess you can't like holler at me because we're not in the same room, but put it in the chat and let's try to have two-way dialogue here. Pretty please. So I really like this graphic on equity. You have the test master saying for fair selection, everyone has to take the exact same exam. Please climb that tree. And then you've got a dog, a seal, a fish in a fishbowl, an elephant, a crow, a monkey, and a penguin. Equity is not equalness or sameness, right? It's not what you would traditionally think of as everyone gets the same amount, so it's fair. It's not affirmative action or a handout. It's not an initiative that you can put in a binder and pack away. I would like for us to, I tried to click it on my screen. Mimi, will you click the YouTube video, pretty please? Just to give us an understanding of why equity is important and why we're still talking about equity. When I watched this, there we go. I was gonna say, I think there was music, but there's no voiceover. So for those who don't have sound, you're not missing voiceover. So these are just kind of some of the historic barriers that have led us to inequitable situations. This one is particularly that have led to the current situation of needing to discuss equity. So got another minute and a half left. Mimi, you can go ahead and cut. Thank you. Oh, yeah. So this is not an affirmative action conversation. It was just a good video that was made for that cause. Okay, so if you'll advance pretty please. Equity is. I think we've all seen the graphics where you've got folks looking over the fence and there's like the 1 box, 2 box, 3 box thing to make sure everyone's the same height. I really liked this one though, which shows that, first of all, for some people, they don't need a box, they need a ramp, right? So you need to think about what the equity barrier is and what the person that you're trying to serve actually needs. But second of all, I really liked in the middle here where the little girl is a little bit higher than the gentleman to her left, because it doesn't take away from his experience at all for her to get a little bit higher, right? Like if it took 2 boxes for her to be able to see over the fence because 1 wasn't going to be enough for her, then give her 2 boxes. If the young man in the wheelchair needed a ramp that was still a little bit higher than her 2 boxes, that's what he needed. But it didn't affect either of their experiences for him to have the ramp and have the equitable solution that allowed him to see the race, right? So I think it's important that we realize that, again, equity is not equality. It's not sameness. True equity usually implies that an individual may need to experience or receive something different, not equal, in order to maintain fairness and access. So again, to the same point, if you paid attention in the video, you noticed that there were all kinds of obstacles and barriers that were coming for 2 individuals, right? So for those individuals, you may need, for instance, a go-kart to get them to the end, right? And that may seem unfair to the person who was on the moving walkway, but what the person who is on the moving walkway has to get him to the finish line is fewer barriers than the folks who have all of these, and I don't know if you caught the years, but all of these centuries of barriers that led to the dead end that you saw for the Black woman in the video. We can advance pretty please. Okay, so once you figure out diversity and how to value other people's perspectives and differences, and then you figure out equity and this idea that it might not necessarily mean everyone is treated or behaves the same, then we move on to inclusion. Inclusion is the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized. I really want to focus on what inclusion is not. It's not assimilation, right? So it's not you're all here and let's all behave the same. Let's all put aside our differences. It's not this failure to acknowledge, again, like we talked about in diversity. And it's not the burden of the excluded or marginalized. So often we see that Black women in particular disproportionately do the inclusion work at organizations, and they are disproportionately volunteering, right? And again, to use a higher ed example, Black women do a lot of the service work and it counts against them on tenure. So not only are they not paid for it and not getting credit, it counts against them on this thing that they are in the workplace to achieve, right? It is not the burden of the people who are excluded to think about how they should be included. It is not the burden of the autistic children and their families to think about their well-being in the conversation about masks. It's not the burden of Black, Hispanic, Indigenous people to think about how they should have A, better access to healthcare, and B, how they should combat the disproportionate rates which they're dying of COVID, right? It is the burden of the people in control to think about those things. And again, I think that's something that seems like it's so common sense, but it's something that we see over and over again, that diversity and equity and inclusion committees are disproportionately filled with the people who are excluded, trying to make things right. So without a commitment from everyone, but particularly those in power, right? It can't be a bottom up objective. It has to be top down. So I really like this puzzle piece this puzzle on inclusion. Diversity is taking all of the different pieces and recognizing their difference, and inclusion is figuring out how to make them fit together without losing their own identities, without having to silence their perspectives or their voices. So I want to go over in the 7 pillars of inclusion. I can't tell, Whitney, if your hand is raised for new comments or if it's still raised.
No, that was old. Go ahead and lower it.
Okay. So we're going to go through these fairly quickly because I want us to be able to talk about these in small groups too. So Mimi, will you advance, please? The first pillar of inclusion is access. Access is about more than just whether people are allowed or integrated into your culture or your organization. And that's super important, right? Because again, in this conversation about integration, they said, well, we didn't say these people can't come here anymore, but were they welcome when they got there? Are people of color welcome in spaces that were traditionally excluded, they were traditionally excluded from them? So I would like for you to pull out the piece of paper and pen that you went to get in the beginning, hopefully, and just kind of ask yourself these questions. How do people who are not like you experience interactions with you, with your organization? And how can you adjust your interactions to be more welcoming and promote greater access? So for me, I give this example. I went to a historically Black university. A lot of my friends went to historically Black universities. And so there's this ribbing that happens sometimes with me and friends who did not go to historically Black university, right? They're obviously allowed to come to my house, but if we are sitting at the card table, there might be a comment about the type of institution that raised them, right? So that's just a very comical example of how people experience me at my house, like even though they were allowed to come here, and whether they necessarily feel welcome while we are playing cards. So I would love for everyone to just take a second, think about kind of your things that might make people feel like they're not welcome even if they have the access, and how you can adjust. So we'll just do like a 1 minute and run through. Is there anyone who wants to share anything? And if not, then this is intended to go quickly, but is there anything that stood out here on access for anyone?
No, I'm pretty much a clown.
So I would get along here. All right, so we'll move on to the next one, which is attitude. Attitude is your willingness to actually make measurable progress, even if it means you have to give something up. So again, I have a lot of these conversations at major Research One universities. And the first question I usually ask when they bring me in is, do you actually want to change, or are we checking a box today? Right? And it makes people uncomfortable from the beginning. But if you don't actually want to change, and that's a very different conversation and presentation than if you do want to change. So here I have us asking ourselves, how committed are you really to promoting a welcoming environment for everyone? Are you willing to give something up to create a more equitable experience for others? How far will you go to make it happen, especially if you are not affected by the lack of inclusion in the current environment? I think one great example here is in the military, the don't ask, don't tell policy, right? Which is no longer in place, but when it was in place, are people, can I put the questions? Let's see, Miss Shirley. Yes, ma'am. I was saying that the don't ask, don't tell policy, if you are not a person who identifies as LGBTQ, then it doesn't affect you, right? But are you willing to speak up to say that this policy is wrong, that it marginalizes people who are standing next to you in service? So I'm going to take a second to type the questions into the chat box for Ms. Shirley while you guys are taking a second to think. See, I wish I had like a copy paste here. Allison says that she's been thinking about the bathroom laws today. She likes having men and women separation in public bathrooms, but it means problems for transgendered people. I am with you kind of in that space. where like I have children who are 10 and 13, and in theory, I like gendered restrooms because I have 10 and 13-year-old children. But I have a child who is really close to our family sphere who is a transgendered child, right? So what does that identify for this young lady who identifies as, or I'm sorry, this young man who identifies as a young man, right? Like, I agree that that creates an inclusion issue for him, even though it protects my comfort of having my children in, like Allison said, having my girl in a woman's space or my boy in a boy space. And I think this works. If people want to share in the chat, then you can. But if not, then we're going to share in groups. Mimi, will you move us along, pretty please? The third is choice. Choice requires you to have a conversation, right? What options do people want and how would they like to be included? So my favorite example of this is, and I'm using favorite tongue in cheek, is during the summer when we had all of the Black Lives Matter protest and activity, and members of Congress showed up in kente cloth and kneeled in the Capitol Rotunda. I was like, whose idea was this? Did you ask us what we wanted? Because that's not, we actually just want you to stop killing us. We don't actually want you to show up in kente cloth in the Capitol. So this is a really good example of, did you even talk to the people that you're trying to include, right? Did you ask them how they want to experience you or your organization? And if not, why not? So that's the ask yourself prompt here. Is how do you even ask the people? And I think that this one we get caught up a lot because even the best intentioned people who are believing that we are thinking about other people, if you haven't even asked the people that you believe yourself to be thinking about, then have you really included them, right? Like, if I don't even ask my children what they want for dinner, but call myself cooking their favorites, am I really giving them choices?
I think that also has to do with the people you choose to approach about it, because that's the biggest issue I see in this world today is people being afraid of either the truth or afraid to speak the truth.
Yep.
And it has to be a comfort. Like, there has to be a comfort where my friends who, in particular, one of my friends, white, male, gay, came to me and was like, what is the Black Lives Matter movement about? Like, I don't understand it. And there has to be some kind of comfort to be like, you know what? I know this person's not going to BS me. They'll tell me, hey, you look ridiculous in kente cloth trying to kneel out there. That looks like you're pandering. Doesn't look good, you know? So there's all kinds of choices involved, and then it becomes difficult. And sometimes we have to be willing to break the eggshells that we're worried about walking on to sit up there and truly do the right thing. And being uncomfortable is the only way to really, for us to get comfortable. That's how I see.
I'm going to read out some of the comments here. Whitney says that working in a middle school, she sees students struggling often with their sexuality and what it means to share that with their parents and peers. I will always stick my neck out for them because I will always hope that someone will be an ally for me when it comes to race. Clarence asked if that's because integrity is uncomfortable. Cindy said that she heard a program recently on people likely avoid sensitive questions because they are just afraid it will be insulting, when the truth is they want to be asked tough questions. But I think that, again, that requires a conversation. So my stepmom is very, very white. Like, before she met me, the only Black people she had seen were domestic workers who had worked for her family, came from a very wealthy background. And I appreciate that some days when things are happening, she'll kind of feel me out and see if I feel like talking to her, because some days I don't, and that's a very real thing. But B, if I seem to feel like talking to her, she'll ask if I feel like talking about the thing that she has questions about, right? So some days I don't want to be asked tough questions. Some days you have to ask for permission to dump on me. Like, your guilt, again, is not the burden of the marginalized person, right? So you have to ask for permission before you just approach people with a barrage of tough questions in the name of progress. Charlotte says approaching people who are perceived to be more palatable. I think that's definitely related to what Aisha was saying, right? You decide who is the safe person, who is the person who is going to give you the less controversial response. Clarence says validation. All right, let's go on to the next bubble, which is partnership. Partnership is really important because sometimes we don't think of the ways that we benefit from things, right? I talk a lot with my friends group about how the greatest thing that I feel like I owe my children more than inheritance, which I feel like they'll get, but I don't know if I feel like I owe them that, is access to my network, right? I think that the biggest thing that we don't think about when we think about inclusion is these connections and networks that we have. The fact that hiring decisions are usually made within our networks, right? Or the network of the hiring manager. For me, when I am seeking out contractors or I'm looking to hire people for projects, they're usually people who either look like me or people who I know or have worked with in previous projects, right? Collaborative work agreements. So I would like for us to take a second here to think about whether there are introductions you can make between individuals you know that will promote a greater sense of equity and inclusion. How can you leverage your networks and connections to create a more welcoming experience for people in your social and organizational spaces? So again, I think about children, right? I have godchildren and a cadre of nieces and nephews. And I feel like what I owe my nieces and nephews is taking them to the places and exposing them to the things that they might not have seen without their auntie, right? Without somebody to show them those things. I think a lot about in DC, you have kids who live east of the river who have never experienced downtown, even though the metro is free, even though all of the museums and all of the federal buildings are free to go into, right? But no one told them that they could go there and no one introduced them or showed them. So I think that in translating to this partnership conversation, like what ways can you be a partner in just giving people access to networks? And y'all can write it down and or post it in the chat. And we'll go on to the next one as we do that. Communication is next. Communication is about how we let people know the opportunities are available and how we welcome them into the spaces. I was reading an article a couple of weeks ago about how Black women and white women show up in the workplace and how Black women traditionally want to have like moments of real talk, right? Like they want to just address things head on, get them out there, let's find solutions and go forward, right? Like now that we've talked about it, we don't have to talk about it again. But the article is saying that white women are trained to avoid conflict and there's like a whole culture around dancing around those head-on conversations in the workplace. So if you have a Black employee who prefers to like come at it and address it, and then you have a white employee who's like, this is impolite and this is not the way that we need to tackle this, how is your communication to each other affecting your ability to make progress? But if you're in a situation, the article was also saying that this negatively affects Black women in the workplace because we are not usually the ones who are in power. And so we'll be seen as angry or rocking the boat and then eventually end up fired because we're not right for the culture, just because of these communications differences. So to ask yourself here is, are you actively reaching out to the people you want to attract, or is the burden on them to find you? Are you communicating with them according to their communication norms and preferences or yours? So again, another good example here is that if you call me out of the blue, I probably won't answer. If you shoot me a text, I'll answer pretty quickly, right? Like my communication preference is that you do not call me without asking first. Email is usually good for me, but email is not good for other people. Have you even asked your target audience what their communication preferences are? This is one that we talk a lot about in education too, right? Because if you're saying, why aren't parents engaged? Black and brown parents may not respond to your mass email. They just may not. They may require more one-on-one personal conversation or outreach. They may require like meeting, a face-to-face meeting with the teacher to get engaged, right? Like they just may not, that is culturally true. They just may not respond to mass emails asking for them to take action. And that doesn't mean that they don't care about their children's education. It just means that you are not communicating with them in a way that resonates with them. What are the cultural communications norms that might impact the way your communication is received or how you are responding to others? So this one I actually would like to get a little bit of conversation on, because I think our tendency as people is to treat people the way that we want to be treated and not necessarily treat people the way they want to be treated.
Oh, I can speak on that. Anybody else want to go? Because I got a mouth. Okay, I'm one of those people. I'm a bit more East Coast. It's on my mind. I let it out. I'm that person she was talking about.
No, that's beautiful. We need that here, right? Because like what we're talking about is that false perception that this is a hostile, angry, unprofessional, ghetto Black woman, right? Instead of an individual who's a power base, right? I forgot what I was going to say because you did that. Thank you.
Oh, my bad. No, the thing is that, okay, so a long time ago, my mom is live and let live. Okay. That has been a motto that has gotten me through many things. And don't expect people to treat you the way you treat them. So I'm an ask and don't assume person. And I notice some people get frustrated because they're like, I don't know how to communicate with this person. What's going on? And I usually was that female other females would talk to about guys. And so my big thing is if you feel like you're not getting through or you're not getting a timely response, it doesn't hurt to ask, hey, did you receive my email? If they're like, no, why not? Perhaps they don't check their email that often. Work from the assumption of giving someone the benefit of the doubt, but also work from the assumption that there may be an excuse to it. Now, some people may run around because they really don't like you or don't like looking at those emails or whatever. Forget about that. We need to communicate. And I need to understand you. You need to understand me. We're trying to work together. Now, as far as the angry thing, I've rarely dealt with that. But I think also it's because typically I seem all bubbly and giggly until I'm not. And then I don't mind so much because I want you to take me seriously in those moments. And that's where I got the